Hey, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran, wishing you all a very happy new year, joining us into 2025. Last week was not around to do an episode, just kind of recovering from the holidays, as I'm sure many of you were. But we're back in it, and this week we actually have two episodes because a lot's been happening and a couple things I kind of want to talk about. So the NFL season has concluded, the regular season has concluded, and typically in the day after, a lot of people call it Black Monday, which is because a lot of teams that didn't make the playoffs, they decide to part ways with their coach. And as usual, that did happen here again this year. Really not a lot of Black Monday firings as there normally are. You had Gerard Mayo get fired almost instantly after the Patriots won against the Bills to close out their season. Then you had Antonio Pierce from the Raiders get fired and Doug Peterson from the Jaguars. And they joined some of the midseason firings, which were Matt Eberflus in Chicago, Dennis Allen in New Orleans, and Robert Saleh in New York for the Jets. And I kind of want to focus on Pierce and Mayo here for a second. So going into this year, the NFL had 6 black coaches out of its 32, which I've always thought was a criminally low number. The NBA, for example, over half of their coaches are black. You figure in the sport that a lot of times brings in former players in the coaching ranks, you would think that you would have, since the league is predominantly black, you would have more black coaches. But we don't usually have a lot. And 6 is actually historically more than normal, right? So I do think it's interesting that 2 of those 6 have been fired, and that's Antonio Pierce and Gerard Mayo. But more interestingly is that they were both fired after only having the job for 1 year. And so I kind of want to run through the list here of black coaches that we have in the league right now. So you have Raheem Morris in his first year in Atlanta. Very disappointing season. I think he's probably on a short leash if they don't improve and make the playoffs or win the division next year. I think he could be on the chopping block. D'Amico Ryans in Houston, he seems pretty secure right now. One of the hotter young coaches in the league, even though there has been a little bit of a slight regression by the Texans and C.J. Stroud this year. Antonio Pierce fired after 1 year. Gerard Mayo fired after 1 year. Mike Tomlin obviously is incredibly long tenured, but even now there are rumblings about him being let go because the Pittsburgh Steelers are neither terrible nor great. They win between 8 and 10 games a year and generally make the playoffs, but have not been able to do much since the last time they were in the Super Bowl when Tomlin had just started with the Steelers. And lastly, you have Todd Bowles in Tampa, who has made the playoffs, is in his second or third coaching stop as a head guy. And when you look at it from the sense of 2 black coaches were given the boot after 1 year, how often have coaches been given the boot after a year? So since 2011, 11 coaches have been one and done. You know, you had guys like Jim Tomasula, Chip Kelly, Frank Reich, which were just like complete train wrecks. But of the one and done coaches, 5 of them have been black coaches. You know, Steve Wilkes in Arizona was another one. And I just feel like when you observe the situations that both Mayo and Pierce walked into, to fire them after 1 year feels just kind of like they were set up for failure more than anything, because Pierce, let's start with Pierce. He walks into a Raiders job. Now, he is now the 5th coach fired since Mark Davis took over about a decade ago. So they've gone through guys like Josh McDaniels, Jack Del Rio, Dennis Allen, who we mentioned earlier, Gruden with the disaster that he was with the off-the-field stuff and the comments and all that. But they get rid of Pierce after 1 year. Walking in, they had no run game. They had just let Josh Jacobs walk in free agency to Green Bay. They didn't have the answer at QB because Aiden O'Connell was starting most of the season, as was Gardner Minshew. You know, that's just not going to win in a league that prioritizes quarterback play. The defense was young and depleted, and you know they competed. You know they were in a lot of games, got blown out a few times. They're in a lot of these games, but they end up moving on from it. And so that felt like an inevitability that, a lot of time, and the Raiders really ever since 2000 have been one of the more poorly run organizations in the NFL. Then you flip over to Jerome Mayo. And, the Patriots are supposed to be this kind of standard bearer, the gold standard franchise in the NFL or in the modern NFL. Obviously, a lot of that is the residuals of the Kraft, Brady, Belichick trio that dominated the last 2 decades, right? But he was let go after a year in which he has a talent deficient roster, not really spending any money on players, and it was the rookie year of the QB that they just drafted, who has shown good signs. But I think Mayo's biggest problem was that, one, I think that Robert Kraft was trying to show something here because Mayo still had the linkage to Belichick. And I think Kraft kind of wants to show that he's over the whole Belichick thing, that this is his show now, and his sons who are going to be taking over for him as he nears closer to retirement. And getting away from that made a lot of sense for Kraft and for the Patriots because they're trying to separate themselves from the whole Bill Belichick thing. But again, I just feel like he was set up to fail because when you fire somebody after a year, I just feel like we're in a situation where it's like you're only going to retain your job if you are able to accomplish a miracle. Meanwhile, to look at like white coaches, Shane Steichen, after a disappointing end to another year, is being retained. Brian Daboll in New York being retained because basically the Giants don't want to deal with another head coaching search, and they want some level of continuity. So it's not that. It just feels like the black coach is held to a higher standard and a more impossible standard to attain. And if somebody like Tomlin has winning season after winning season, and there's talk about him, being let go, I don't know how true that is, but the fact that the conversation exists tells you the landscape here. I feel like this was the situation a little bit for Bill Cowher as he was entering his end in Pittsburgh, but they kind of let Bill Cowher kind of maneuver it on his own terms. And if Tomlin doesn't get that same treatment, then I think the double standard is clearly at play here. I think it's already visible, but if anybody had doubts, there it is, right? So let's talk a little bit more about why this happens. Coaches get signed to multi-year deals. They're not like on a annual renewal basis, right? They get 3, 4, 5, sometimes even longer contracts. And it's a lot of money. It's millions of dollars, right? Because these NFL organizations are cash cows. So, and the owners, I think, kind of want to win more than anything. So you have a situation where if you don't think it's right, you could probably just move on from the coach. And I think it all starts at ownership. It's important to understand that an owner is somebody who is used to success. It's a very, very small number of people that can own an NFL franchise. There's only 32 of them that you could have, right? It's a very elite fraternity. A lot of times it's kind of like it's a club, right? One thing like that has enraged President-elect Donald Trump was that he was never allowed into that fraternity when he was trying to buy a team. It's why he went to the USFL and bought the Generals and that whole thing. But these owners are rich, successful business people in some industry. And, they understand how to run a business and how to make a business successful. But it also means that they're relatively impatient when it comes to, quote unquote, trusting a process, because they'll look at their payroll like, hey, I'm paying $100, $150, $200 million for these players and coaches, and they're not winning on the field, and I look like a joke, right? And especially like in the media, they talk about, the owner needs to act, the owner needs to do this. So the owner gets impulsive and decides to act, and then you end up with just this consistent cycle of hiring the wrong people. And then they get involved in the hiring process because they want to take ownership. This is their company now. They want to handle it. And they don't know what to do because they don't know what to look for in a football person. They know what to look for somebody who crunches spreadsheets all day, or a creative content person, or, just like a vice president of HR or something like that, right? They know what to look for those type of people, but they don't know what to look for in the football coach, X's and O's, and all that. So in a lot of ways, they're just kind of like us fans, right? And they're just kind of hoping that something that they think will happen actually happens. So it leads to this impatience because they're like, we're spending all this money and you're not getting us results. So when the coach is fired after 1 or 2 years, they'll look at the record. They're like, hey, you're 4-13, you're 5-12. That's not good enough. I spent this many millions. I bought in all these free agents. I got you the staff you asked for, and you're not getting me results. And when a lot of these guys are on yearly calendars or quarterly calendars, it's not the same in sports. Sports is on a multi-year calendar, right? You see improvements to hopefully be good in 3 to 4 years, right? But it's just these owners now, they want success now, they want return on investment now, they want to sell playoff tickets, right? So that's kind of the impasse here, which is the way success is typically charted in football, basketball, whatever sport, versus how it is in the boardroom in these other type of companies. And I think that's the divide you have here when somebody just gets rid of a guy after a year or even 2 years. So another thing is, a lot of it goes on win-loss record. But really, how do we gauge success? How do you gauge success of a team that isn't competing for a Super Bowl, right? That might have their coach on the hot seat. I think in the case of New England, they just got the QB. So what you were looking for in terms of success was, how is that QB adapting to the NFL? How is that QB progressing under your tutelage throughout the course of that season? And if you see that improvement, then maybe you're worth keeping around. Now, if you don't see the improvement, then maybe you're not worth keeping around, right? If you're hindering the development of that QB. So in many ways, quarterback success is tied to a coach's tenure. And with the Raiders, they didn't have the QB in place. New England, they did. And, he is... he's been let go, even though Drake May has looked really good and looks like he's going to be a really good player for many years to come. The fear then becomes, can I trust this guy to really advance his skill set in a really meaningful way? Look at another guy who got fired, Doug Peterson. It seems like Trevor Lawrence, his quarterback, has regressed a bit since he took over. So when you see that, you make that decision to move on from Peterson. And I was honestly surprised that Peterson wasn't let go in the middle of the year, because the Jags were basically helpless for the last 10 weeks of the year. And obviously Lawrence went out with a season-ending injury, and it was the Mac Jones show from there on. But you really got to gauge success there on how they're improving. Are they staying competitive? Are they not being embarrassed, right? And then you say, okay, do we have young players that we could build upon? Who are our building blocks? And I think a lot of owners don't see it that way. They only see it from a wins and losses perspective. And how many jerseys am I selling? How many tickets am I selling? And they're taking a very businessy mind to it, and they don't really have an appreciation for team building. And I think that also puts the pressure on the coach to make win-now decisions. So Pierce, maybe the more prudent development decision was to go with Aiden O'Connell all the time. But instead, he goes with Gardner Minshew a lot because he's trying to win games to preserve his job, right? So, and especially with the Raiders, you're in a job there in the division with 3 other really good teams. The Chiefs are in your division, the Chargers, who've gotten a lot better, and the Broncos, who just made the playoffs. All 3 of these teams are in the playoffs, so it's a tough division to navigate. So you're under even more pressure, more scrutiny. And I think this type of scrutiny makes me think a bit now about the 2 coordinators that the Detroit Lions currently employ. So Ben Johnson on the offensive side and Aaron Glenn on the defensive side. Both of these guys are being interviewed and requested for jobs, for head coaching jobs. And Johnson famously last year kind of declined any offers to take on any jobs because he thought they were building something special in Detroit, which, newsflash, they are. Aaron Glenn now is kind of having multiple interview opportunities like the Jets and the Bears and a bunch of other teams, because he's kind of, especially after this last week against Minnesota, has kind of come out and shown that he's a elite schemer defensively, especially what he was able to do against that Vikings offense with the amount of players that he was missing off of his defensive starting group, right? But Are these guys really better off taking another job? Is what's going to kind of become the thing. So if you're Ben Johnson, and I think Ben Johnson's been the one who's been more talked about than Aaron Glenn because the offense has consistently been innovative and scoring a bunch of points throughout the year. They are second all time in touchdowns scored behind only the 2013 Broncos. And so if you're Ben Johnson, you're looking at your situation with Dan Campbell. Dan Campbell handles all the media stuff. He's the face of the organization. All you do, really, is you coach up your offensive guys, you scheme up some fun plays, and you execute. When you're the head coach, you now have to adapt yourself to being the president, so to speak, right? And you're dealing with the media, you're dealing with the owner, you're dealing with both sides, or all three sides if you factor in special teams. You got to hire a staff, you got to work with scouts, you got to do all this stuff. And when you look at how a lot of these owners are really temperamental, you have to kind of ask yourself, am I just kind of better off here and just building on success? And now there is an ego thing at play, right? In football, you always kind of want it to be your show, right? That's like the sports thing. You want to show that you are the guy. You're the one who handled it. You're the one who gets things done. And a great example of this is Steve Spagnuolo in Kansas City. Obviously, he rose to prominence as a defensive coordinator with the Giants, was the D coordinator for that team when they won both of their Super Bowls with Eli Manning. Got a job at the Rams and was a disaster. One of the worst coaching situations we've seen in the last 25 years. To the point, he's not looked at as rehirable. But in a way, it's been a blessing in disguise. He's been able to implement his defense with really good results in Kansas City, has won a couple Super Bowls from it, and has kind of probably going to go down as one of the best defensive coordinators we've ever seen, especially probably one of the best ones in the modern era. And I just wonder, do we start to see more of that? More of a coordinator saying, you know what? Grass isn't always greener on that other side. I'll stay where I'm at. We saw it with Ben Johnson last year, Bobby Slowick last year as well with the Texans. Now, granted, you could say, well, you might not get another opportunity or whatever. I think with college becoming more pro-like, there are more opportunities for these type of guys where they can be a little more selective. And I think that's where, like, the Chicago Bears are going to have a little bit of trouble attracting a coach. It's why they're trying to interview Mike McCarthy. It's why they've been linked to trying to trade for Mike Tomlin or even trying to trade for Kevin O'Connell, which would be unprecedented to get somebody like that within the division. But I just think that coordinators probably have to take a long look in the mirror and really think, is that what I really want? I got a good thing going on right here. Do I really want to risk it? And I think it's interesting. Now, the flip side of that is a guy who stayed in and backfired on him is somebody like Eric Bieniemy with Kansas City. He was getting a lot of looks as a head coach, turned it down, stayed. Now he's kind of floundering around in college. So there's kind of two sides to the equation there. But I think if you're a coordinator, it's something you got to consider at the very least. So kind of wrapping up here, is there really a solution to the volatility of the coaching position in the NFL? And I don't think so. Because these teams, are going to be, they're monarchies, right? The owner is the king in the castle. And the king of the castle is going to get what the king of the castle wants. And I think that what we're seeing here is a bunch of teams that are run by these guys. Like, you look at the Colts with Irsay, just a not stable individual. Jerry Jones, very temperamental with Dallas. A lot of these owners don't really have, this patience. Especially a lot of them are older, right? So they're kind of the mindset, hey, I want to win now. And I don't know how long I'm going to be here to wait around for a 5-year rebuild, right? That's where I think the Chiefs have done a pretty good job. The Hunt family has kind of stayed out of it. With the Steelers, the Rooney family kind of stays out of it. But then you have other owners like the Browns, very meddling. And as a result, they've been a joke of a franchise. We see the reports about the Jets and Woody Johnson and what he's done. That report by Diana Rossini in The Athletic. And I just think it's a volatile position because the jobs are so coveted. Because you're always going to have somebody who wants to coach an NFL team. And Is there a solution? I don't think so. I think that if you're a coach who's applying for these jobs, interviewing for these jobs, really look at the situation. Really look at the ownership situation. Is this somebody I can handle? Right? Is this a personality that I won't clash with? I think that's the ultimate question. And if your answer is yes, I can handle this personality, then yeah, it's the right job for you. If not, hey, maybe being a coordinator for a few extra years, at $1 million or $2 million a year, not the worst thing in the world. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap up another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. Thank you, as always, for tuning in and listening. Again, 2 episodes out this week. This is the first of those 2. If you enjoy the podcast, please consider subscribing and following on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Our show is on video on YouTube now, as it is on Spotify. So make sure to check that out. Until next time, I'm your host, Omar Zaran, Deep Cover Podcast. We'll see you later.